Chapter 5 of Hunters Out of Space. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elliot Miller. Hunters Out of Space by Joseph E. Kelliam. Chapter 5. As the boat sped over the water, leaving a churning wake behind it, Jack Odin remembered that first sea voyage he had made on the seas of Opal. It was June time then, and Maya had been with him. Perhaps they had thought that June would last forever. Perhaps they had thought that all of life would go by at 5 miles per hour, remembering that slow, wonderful trip, almost like a voyage in a dream. He sighed as he held on to the skipping boat. They were now going well over 60. Gunnar seemed to sense his thoughts. "Wolden has ordered speed and more speed, my friend," he called over the roar of the motor. "The governors are all gone from the old machines. The smiths are turning out newer and faster ones all the time. Sometimes I think even the hands of the clock are going faster." Odin muttered a curse. What he had loved about this world was its leisure. What he had hated about his own world above was its constantly increasing speed. Like a squirrel caught in a cage, his world had gone faster and faster until reality had vanished into a mad blur of turning wheels and running feet. Oh well, he thought, a man is like a pup. Contented enough until life takes him by the scruff of the neck and shakes him up and proves to him that things change and a pup's world changes and he had better accustom himself to the new standards or be shaken up again. So they sped on through the low waves while the tower loomed nearer and taller before them. Gunnar was guiding with one hand while he talked into a little square box of gleaming metal. He turned his head and the boat careened into a trough that set it to shaking. "I have contacted Woden and Ato," he called cheerfully. "They are meeting us at the dock. Not the old dock. It's still underwater. The new one's farther up the street." As they neared Orthgard, Gunnar slowed the boat. Looking down into the murky water, Jack Odin could detect now and then the faintly traced shadow of a roof or a tower. Once as he looked down at a finely carved weather vane, a huge fangfish rolled between him and his view. A white belly gleamed through the water, and a serrated mouth opened wide. Its jaws bent out of proportion by the reflection of the water. It reminded Odin of the old story of the monster of chaos, rushing with gaping mouth to swallow the works of men. Then they were at the dock, which was scarcely a dock at all, but a place where the waters ended halfway up the sloping streets of the city. One thing had not changed. To the last, the people of Opal refused to take part in any governmental excitement. A car was there, a driver. Wolden was there looking much thinner and grayer. Beside him was his son Ato, inches taller and perhaps a bit thicker in the shoulders and a bit thinner in the waist. These were all. He had nearly broken his neck half a dozen times to get there, but Jack Odin was glad that the old idea had survived. Being reared so near to Washington, he had been puzzled for years over his country's mile-long processions and the spectacle of thousands rushing to watch a parade for some visiting celebrity or some current politician who would be forgotten before the next snow. He and Wolden shook hands. Odin was surprised at the change in him. When last seen, Odin had been a man just leaving the prime of life. Too much of a brain, perhaps. A bit too curious and a bit too fearful of the affairs of the world. But now the hand was weak. The face was thinner and grayer, although even nobler than it had been. But the eyes were sad and pained, as though they had seen too much and had dreamed dreams beyond the comprehension of his fellows. Somehow Odin found himself remembering a lecture about Addison, who probably knew as much as anyone about the hearts of men, but upon being made second high man in his government could only stand tongue-struck in the presence of Parliament. Then there was Ato. The months had changed him too. He stood tall and lean, and there was a deep line running from each cheekbone down his face. He looked older, but his eyes were piercing now, while his father's were somber. Strife and hard work had sweated all the fat from his bones. He seemed much stronger than when Odin had first met him. But here was something more than strength. Ato had developed into a first-class fighting man. Wolden could never have been a fighter. There was something both terrifying and sad in the comparison. Ato looked like a man who could calmly send 100,000 to their deaths for one objective, while Wolden would have theorized and rationalized until the objective was lost. The old comparison between the impulsive executive and the liberal arts man who had learned that there are only one or two positive decisions available in all the world of thinking. But each in his own way was glad to see Odin and welcomed him back to the ruins of Opal. Then, just before the reunion was over, the clouds grew grayer and it began to rain. As they got into the little car, Wolden told Odin that they would have to circle the bay before going to the tower on a ferry, since the lower stories were still underwater. The city had once been beautiful with trees. Now they stood like giant skeletons, drowned by the seawater. Here and there, a few limbs struggled to put out their leaves. The rain was cold, colder than Odin had ever felt in Opal before. He shivered, but there was something more than the cold dankness of the air to make him shiver. Then they came to the ferry, and the ferryman was so old and bent that Odin looked twice at him to make sure he wasn't one-eyed. He wasn't. So the ferry creaked its way out to the tower, to an improvised landing just below the 6-story windows. They climbed through the windows into a huge room that seemed to be carved of fairy foam, and behind them the rain grew heavier and the thunder rolled in the distance and the lightning flashed like witch fires across the jaded sky. 3 days had passed since Gunnar and Odin had returned to Opal. Dr. Jack Odin stretched out on a huge bed and felt the strength of his ultraviolet light upon the ceiling, pouring into his shoulders. In the next room, Gunnar was bathing and complaining about the seawater. Drinking water in Opal was now at a premium. Odin had been in the dumps. Now he was feeling better, although memory of the sodden ruins that he had seen in the last 3 days would never leave him. "And are you howling, my strong little man?" he called out cheerfully. "In Korea I once bathed in a mud puddle and enjoyed the bath." Gunnar's first few words were unprintable. "There was a river close to my house where the water ran silver once over the tops of the ford. And there Gunnar used to bathe. This is slop, Norse King. Nothing but slop." Odin laughed again. "You're getting old, Gunnar. Did anyone ever guarantee that ford would be for you always?" Gunnar, dripping water and with a towel wrapped around his middle, came dashing into the room. He stood there, his arms and shoulders flexed. "And does Gunnar look too old to fight?" he asked. Odin blinked. Gunnar's muscular development had always amazed him. The short man stood an inch less than 5 feet. His chest and shoulders must have measured more than that. His muscles writhed like iron snakes as he moved. His biceps and forearms were those of a smith, which indeed Gunnar had been, for Gunnar had been many things. The huge torso slanted down to a narrow waist and hips. Then his short legs propped him up like carved things of oak. Gunnar had once killed a bull with one blow of his fist. He had once snapped a man's back across those bulging, stubby thighs. Gunnar disappeared in search of fresh clothing. Odin lay there, thinking of all the things he had seen since returning to Opal. Although the water level was still high up on the tower, the lower floors had been made watertight and had been pumped dry. On his first trip to the tower, Odin had little chance to survey the rooms. Now he knew something of what Opal had lost. Curtains, paintings, rugs, statues, the finest furniture. All these had been ruined or damaged by the flood. Each room of the tower had been a work of art. Both Bronze and Neeblings had contributed to it, back in the days when they were working shoulder to shoulder. In spite of his thoughts for Maya, he could not help thinking that the Bronze had brought this on themselves. When they tried to put the Neeblings in second place, that was when the bell had sounded. Even so, why had this splendor been reduced to ruin? Oh, there were jewels that could be salvaged, and statues. But the tower was a work of art from top to bottom. The finest lace, china as thin as paper, paintings, these were gone. One might as well salvage Mona Lisa's eyes and swear they were the original. Higher up, where the water had not reached, the machines had been stored along with other treasures. But Opal's best had been waterlogged.